One thing is like one action, one panel. Like that is
heaviest mistake I think I've ever seen.
Yeah, there's some interesting ways that you can get around that, but golly, it's just much easier to just one action, one panel.
Welcome back to Inspired Inc., the Comics Wellspring podcast, a show where we promote indie comic creators and become inspired by what they create and their journey of creating it. Today in the show, we have Neal Allred, one of the writers on the book Outer Spaced. And today on the show, we talk about the craft of writing and approaching scripts with a collaborator writer and how film scripts differ from comic book scripts. All that and so much more on today's Inspired Inc. I feel like when you start creating at like a young age, your ideas are just really, really insane and wild, like almost untangible. And then as you start like getting older and learning about story structure and how things come together, like you start to tighten up like what you're into and like what your ideas can do. And sometimes that makes them like smaller, but like in a good way. And when I look at bands like or stories like what the Amory Wars that Coheed made, it's like just these big, expansive Star Wars, like insane, like ideas. And, I used to have those type of things when I started writing. But as I've kind of grown as a creator, I've kind of like reduced the scale of what I'm doing more and more. I don't know. How is that for you as like honestly kind of a newer creator? I feel like newer to this realm in a sense.
Newer to comics for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. But like, just as a storyteller and a writer, I mean, I've been doing that since I've been like 5 or as far back as I can remember.
Cool.
I remember like the young author contest in our like elementary school, and we would draw basically like a picture book and write a story. And every year I would go, enter, be throwing stories into it, and like, whether it was like a boy and his dog get lost in the woods, or a guy gets sort of, has nerves about like a dentist and is attacked by cavities. Like there were like these absurd ideas that sort of helped, as a stepping stone into that, like finding out like what works in that story, what doesn't work in the story.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, I mean, that's what I actually drew me to comics is like, when I write, I come from like a writing like film background, and coming into comics, it's like, everything has to be much more concise. Like, like your story needs to really come down to like a focal point, as opposed to being sort of this like either like a dialogue heavy, riff back and forth between characters, or even something that you're, like a long plan that you may have. Like you either need to like make that apparent in a comic, like putting like this, like a very heavy seed and then having that pay off, or it sort of needs to be very, very like shrunk down as an idea. So I definitely had larger ideas of stories as like starting out, and then they've definitely turned more into like character based or like incident based, I guess. And like,
yeah, it's weird how you go from like, oh, I'm going to write a concept and I'm going to include all these cool elements and I want all these cool things in my story. And then you have all these cool things and you're like, why doesn't it work? I don't get it. And it's not until you get to like, oh, it's about the character. It's about the person in it. That's what, then you put this character into that place, toss them into that situation, and see how it all turns out and how it unravels and what they do. But it took, like me too, it took me forever to realize like, oh, the character is the most important. Like the story will shape around the character, but that character arc is like the most important thing in your story that people are going to, relate and drive towards and want to get more of.
Yeah, definitely. There's something was taught me as a young kid. And I mean, I'm sure it's like, it always just, comes back into like whenever you're writing, it's like, I remember people writing in, grade school and high school and like writing telling stories about like really cool characters, but they didn't really have any challenges. So it's sort of like something that was taught to me as like a kid was like, take a character, regardless of either how cool or how lame they are, throw them up a tree and just throw stones at them until they have the, you know, the power to come down from that tree. So it's like, I know that that's like an archetype of like conflict and character development, but like that's very, very prominent in just going through. And whenever I'm working on a script, I'm thinking about like, does this serve character? Does this serve conflict? You know, as opposed to cool idea I have, you know what I mean? Like me working with Ben, like it's, we have those ideas all the time, but it always comes back to that very thing, like character or conflict involved, or I mean, sometimes theme, sometimes. Yeah.
I kind of go for like, not necessarily like, I don't call it like a theme. What I do, I call it an armature. It's from this podcast I listen to, You Are a Storyteller. I recommend it to every creator out there. It's one of my favorite things. And they use this, you know, it's not necessarily a theme, but they use what's called like an armature in their writing, which an armature in like in the 80s and 70s, when they would do monster movies, the armature is like the base of those monsters because they would do practical effects. So when you're filming something and pieces fall off and, you know, chunks start flying off, you have your armature to like, oh, I know where, you know, what to replace and where this goes. It's like, it's your guide. It's the shell of everything that everything else goes on top of. So when I'm writing a story, I have to understand the armature so that when I'm straying away and I don't know where I'm going with this character or where to go with the plot, it's like, well, how does this next scene or how does this person serve the armature? And therefore, you know, if I have a statement, Shawshank Redemption, get busy living or get busy diving. It's like one of those things. It's like, you know, whenever you get lost, you think of a theme like that or an idea like that. And you're like, oh, is this complementing like get busy living or get busy dying? You know, like what am I doing to serve that? And that's kind of like my North Star whenever I get lost to help guide me home. I think it's like something that like a lot of, you know, creators use in different ways probably to keep them on track. Do you kind of go off of any of that, you know, but like how do you utilize that in your writing where it comes to handy?
Yeah, no, we definitely dip when we're talking. It's like we're dipping into like themes, and it's, you know, you get into these bits where you're either, you know, you're on a tangent of either character or story, and you're so off base. Like we'll have written like 5 pages, and then we're getting to like the next scene, and we're like, wait a second, we have this all plotted out. Like that's basically like our beat sheet is our armature, is like what we go off of. And so it's like there, like theme is throughout there, and like, you know, but the idea of like having that thing to go back on, like we have like a physical, basically, you know, where we see the story and bumps along the road. But even with that, sometimes something beautiful comes out of that, where you're like, you're going through the story beats, and you have this sort of like moment where you have like a crossroads. And it's like, well, if I went this way instead of like what we had planned, this kind of takes us into a more interesting direction, whether it is like, you know, a moment for where the character is challenged so much that he fails, or if there's like a moment where you have your character, maybe because most of the characters that we write are flawed, is like you have somebody, you know, dip into maybe not the right move. That is maybe more of the anti thing that you thought that they were going to do, because everybody makes mistakes all the time and does stupid impulsive things. So it's like those kind of, when you see those moments in those stories, like the left turn is always more interesting than the right turn to me. So it's like you're going, even in driving, you're going across traffic for most of the time doing a left turn. So it's a little bit more dangerous to like navigate that.
No, that's a great comparison too. But also I like what you're saying about your beat sheet, because I kind of do that. Whenever I think of a story or series, I go, you know, moment by moment, basically what's going to happen in it. But it's also like my first ideas that are coming out. Like you're just kind of flowing in like a flow state where like, oh, and then this is going to happen. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. Oh, and we're going to leave here. Because I don't know about how you might work, but like I try to understand at least an idea of an ending. Like I may not have it solidified, but just like a general, like I see this scene happening at the end. This is about around where it's going to hit, like on the dartboard, and that beat sheet you could kind of chop and toss and like rearrange some stuff as you're discovering while you're writing, because that in the moment layout where you're doing panel by panel the dialogue and seeing the reactions, and then that's when the passion's coming out. You're like, oh yeah, what you're saying, man, I could stick to the beat sheet, but this new kind of direction, it's kind of edgy towards this, and you want to kind of sway when you need to do stuff like that. But that's why your beat sheet's there, because if that doesn't work out, let's go back to the original idea.
Yeah, you got the map. You got the map.
Yeah, you got the map. Yeah, exactly. It's really cool what you're saying also about, what you're saying. You used to do a lot of film stuff, and we'll dive into that a little bit as well. But when it comes down to like film to comics, I always felt like you've described filmmaking into like comic book making in a different perspective for me just now, because I always talk about how filmmaking, like if I couldn't shoot in my apartment or a friend's apartment, like, or some house I know, I'm not going to write in the script. Like it has to be something I can do with my phone camera and DIY, like with nothing. And I felt very restricted like that. And where comics, I'm just like, oh, I could do any bombastic idea, whatever I want. It's just the creator's, path and the artist's capability. But you're absolutely right. You're almost more constrained per moment in something like that than you would be with anything else.
Yeah. No, I mean, like setting and everything. Yeah, you can't. It's hard to do a DIY thing out in outer space, and it's like the options are kind of endless when you have an artist who can draw outer space, and then you don't actually have to go there or shoot on the green screen. But like with the type of stories that I am telling in like filmmaking, it's like it's much more like slice of life, and it's much more of a, like, more or less what you're saying. Like we shot the feature film that we made like in my old apartment. Like we shot and like just out on the town in Austin. But the constraints of like comic is more towards the actual like storytelling, I guess, is like, like you can't, if you overload a reader with, 5 pages of like heavy dialogue, like if you're going to do that, there needs to be some sort of payoff with that. You need to give some time for like the reader to breathe, or like sort of either just take in the visuals or whatever the case may be. Now, if you're doing a film and you have like a long, 5-page dialogue scene, that can go by in 5 minutes, that can go by in 2 minutes, regardless of like, like however it's paced. But I have found like new creative life coming into comics just because it is so much more challenging. And it's like almost utilizing like a different side of my brain in writing. Like it seems like I was much with, writing screenplays, it was much more skeleton. Like I would write basically like a skeleton of everything. And then it's just sort of like slowly feeding everything in. The skeleton could be like a line of dialogue or lines of dialogue, or it could be, a slug line describing a scene. And then like, it can sort of build off of that. And like the comic writing or like the scripting that we do has been a little bit more of like a classical storytelling, where we're writing out the story and then breaking it into panels, as opposed to, so it kind of goes hand in hand with our beat sheet as well. Like we'll create this, whatever story we're working on, we'll create an A to Z of how, this arc of the story goes. And then it sort of like fills in throughout. So ultimately we end up with something that's kind of like a story, like just like a prose story. And then we sort of move that into a paneling. Like with screenwriting, it's like a completely different beast for me to like get into that.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
And like, how much do you think, like what has been a difficulty for you for switching over? There's a lot of pros to it. There's a lot of like things where you can expand on, but like really mindset wise, what are the same like repeat mistakes you found yourself doing going from film to comics? I've seen a lot with a lot of filmmakers going to comics. I'm very curious about yours.
One thing is like one action, one panel. Like that is
heaviest mistake I think I've ever seen.
Yeah, there is. there's some interesting ways that you can get around that, but golly, it's just much easier to just, one action, one panel. I remember when we were first working on the first thing Ben and I were writing, he was like, no, that's not how comics works. I'm like, okay, fair enough. But yeah, that was not a huge hurdle, but it was just sort of like a different rewiring in my brain. It wasn't like, like basically like the slug line of an interior apartment day, X happens, like that's one panel in a comic, but in a screenplay, that's one scene. So like you're basically setting up the scene and then it's like going through there. A little bit different just in like that actually like concise focal point of like that scene. If you were going to take, a scene from a film and put it into a comic, it's going to be much more condensed and much more just meat and potatoes, as opposed to, maybe allowing the characters to breathe a little bit, like in an open setting. Like you can do that with like empty panels, as far as, a character's reaction to what the other character's saying. But like when you're paneling that out, it's again, one action, one panel. That was like a different rewiring for me. It was sort of moving into like, stop trying to, fully form the scene in one panel, as opposed to like a moment in a panel, I guess.
Yeah, no, totally makes sense. I feel like that's the biggest error anyone does. I think as beginning writers, like writers that are transitioning, and it works with prose writers and screenplay writers, because prose writers will add too much detail into everything, where it's just like, okay, now there's too much and we're not letting the artist breathe a little bit. We're being a bit too specific. And it's almost rare that you want an artist that's heavily insanely specific. It's cool to add a couple handful of details for sure, but like when you're doing prose, you're just expanding upon it. And when you're doing screenplays, like even then, like you're reducing, and there's a weird balance you have to do between a screenplay script and a comic script. They're almost so similar, but the key parts are just so vitally different that it could crush either way. Also, I feel like screenplay scripts have like a very, very set format. And if you break that format, you've like broken the laws of the universe. And comics, they're just like, hey, what works best for you,
Yeah, that was also something that I was like, wait, so what's like talking about writing comics? It was like talking to Ben. I'm like, so wait, what's the format here? Like we're just basically writing panel and then like what's going inside. And then you see, I've read comic scripts and I'm like, none of these 10 scripts look at all similar at all.
Yeah.
Like it's like some are written like more of like a play. Some are written very, very, very like minimal. And then some are just sort of like much more seemingly structured in like a format as well.
What does your writing look like as you've kind of switched and now done a couple comic book scripts? Like where have you found your nice balance of writing and description?
We might fall into the category of overwriting description in the panel, but like the main thing was just sort of, I've always been taught to not direct through a script. So like, you're not giving you might give where the character's at, but you're not giving character motivation. You're not doing these things in a script, and you're not doing camera work in a script. So it's moving from that, from basically like a skeleton to this. I wanted to really sort of tell a story, regardless of if you're reading it like panel to panel. Like panel one should have some feeling that is left in panel two, that is left in panel three. So when you're as a reader, I find like, hey, maybe it's a little bit more of an easy read or a little bit more entertaining of a read to have something that feels sort of much more concise as of a story, as opposed to like some of the comic scripts that I've read in like these scripted comic books that I've bought. They sort of have like a easier like X happens, Y happens, Z happens. And then it's like, that's a page on a comic, but it's like maybe 4 or 5 panels that they don't really describe what's happening in the panel. Like ours are much more like, maybe it's like a combination of like screenplay formatting and prose, but it's sort of merged in a way.
I feel like, you know, also unpacking some of that, like overwriting is kind of a good thing, you know? I would rather, and it's something that I've encountered with my comic book writing is that I've underwritten a lot of scripts. And I always have artists coming back, like kind of asking for a little bit more detail or like maybe something more specific. And I feel like if you do overwrite, but not like overly overwrite, it's a weird before you go like into the red, you know, if you're into like touching the yellow over overwriting, I think that's appropriate because you're giving enough for the artist to imagine everything. And still able to play with it. And it's kind of up to them what they could, you know, take and leave at that point. And I think communicating with your artist is really important regarding that because you're like, hey, you know, do as much as you can that you feel comfortable with, but this is me giving you as much detail to make it easier for you. But if it's too much, take out whatever you need to, except for whatever the vital points that are clear in that description, you know?
Yes.
All right, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like, that's very much like how we try to do things. I'm not saying like, you know, the ball has to be red. You know, it's like sort of like the ball is kicked across the street. I'm not telling you what the ball looks like or anything like that. You know,
how many cars are lined up, and that there's the family across staring through the window, and that, you know, 2 other kids are playing coming up the block with then you're just like, okay, what does all this have to do with what's going on with the ball being kicked across the street?
Yeah, we're really trying to just be like telling the story is what we're trying to do. And in the writing, as opposed to like trying to, you know, like we're not directing the artists because it is a collaboration. That's what's kind of beautiful in both filmmaking and comic writing, especially, you know, filmmaking is like you're collaborating with like an entire fucking crew of people. And then like same thing with, you know, with comics, the crew's a little bit smaller than the crew of a film crew, but like there's something beautiful in like when you get a page back and it looks exactly how you imagined, but then there's also something beautiful when you get a page back and you're like, holy crap, I did not see this at all, but this is way better than anything that I could have like imagined, into my mind's eye. Like the way that this was perceived from the artist is like just otherworldly, as opposed to just being like what you had, you know?
Mm-hmm. And with that too, like, you know, there's a difference between like being a director and like a writing as a director, you know, where you're putting camera angles and being very specific about everything and to emotion, to like very specific directorial, you know, script writing versus like a love letter to your artist. You know, I think you write the same way I do, which is like you're writing a very entertaining story to someone. Like you want the artist to be excited and to be at the edge of their seat, but also have a very clear and vivid idea of what's going on. And that's where I think, you know, Story Bible comes into play, because if you have character descriptions, if you have setting, you know, ideas, and if you have like certain things, once they get to the script, they already have so much mapped out in their head. Now it's all falling into place. And it's not so much of like, oh, I'm telling you exactly what to do. It's like, all right, I'm going to tell you the story, and you're going to take the story and to interpret it the best way you can through your art and bring it to life. It's not like a command repeat type of thing, you know? It's more of like, well, here, take this, do what you can with it, and then we'll bring it back together, you know? That's the difference between a collaboration and like a singular, like, you know, like just a hierarchy that doesn't make sense, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. That's one thing also, is we probably put this a lot in like our panel description. It's like, not these words, but more or less like, or whatever you see, you know, like, so it's like, we can sometimes maybe get a little wordy on it, but then there's other times that we're just like, X walks into the room and notices ... next panel ... blank, you know? So it's like, there's some things that we can be sort of more leading with, but there's other things that you can sort of like leave up to complete interpretation, which I
Yeah.
it's just a wonderful medium for just both artists and writers, like, as opposed to, you know,
a challenging puzzle, you know what I mean? That you have to like fit together the right amount of scenes onto the page, right amount of panels, and like pacing. You're just trying to like, there's a difference between what you could do with camera work and editing, you know, post-production versus what you can do with pacing on a page. You know, what you were saying earlier, where you're putting, you know, blank panels, or just like, you know, how the art is structured, what you're taking note of. And I've noticed when I've edited scripts before, when I'm going through something too fast and it's just not enough captions or info, I feel like I'll give back the feedback of like, hey, like, know that you're controlling how fast the reader's going through this. And when there's no words or captions, you're really making them rush. And, you know, if you want to pace them out, give us like even single word, something, captions, boxes, whatever on the page, SFX, noises, whatever. That way you could really control what's going on and how fast they're going to go through it. Do you think that was a struggle for you, you know, film to comic pacing in that sense?
Maybe not so much in like, maybe not so much in going too fast, but maybe going too slow. Like,
oh, how so?
Feel like maybe trying to force like a little bit more dialogue into a scene that sort of expands a scene, or like a character interaction that sort of expands that scene to like, maybe, you know, like what was originally like one page in your or one or two pages turns into like 3 or 4. And it's like, you know, not that like, oh, that's going to ruin everything, but like, I feel like it could sort of drag. Like if you're reading something like, and it's like a dialogue heavy bit, and then you're going through and you're like, oh geez, oh, okay. Like this is, you're doing less. I feel like you're maybe doing a disservice to a couple of different people involved, which is not to say that this is a blanket statement, but you could be doing a, you know, disservice to the reader as well as to the artist. Like if there's something that the artist can show you as opposed to you telling the reader, like maybe that's a more, which is also translates to film making as well, like show don't tell. But like I feel like that's something that I struggled with. Maybe not like, because like Jeff Lemire is like a fantastic writer, but sometimes I blow through his comics like that, because of like, when you're going through 28 pages, there's a lot of panels, but there's not a lot of dialogue sometimes, and you're like, well, I feel like I want to just go back and dip right back into it after I just read it, you know? So like that you kind of have to, you maybe control your pace a little bit more as a reader sometimes with something that like that, where you're just taking in panel by panel. But like as a writer, one of the biggest things that I fear is like dragging, you know, something to be like, oh, well, that scene was like 2 pages too long. It could have been like 3 panels or whatever. You know what I mean? Like I hate to do a disservice to the story, the reader, or the artist. So I feel like
I was just looking over a friend's script recently, and that was the exact thing that they were going on about, was that like, they're like, I didn't know how to get off of this train sequence, like where we go up to the train, we're on the train. I just like couldn't get us off of the train fast enough, and I felt like it's taking up this whole issue. How do I pull back and reduce? And then it's like one of those things where you look at comics of like, well, you got to remember, we don't got to tell everything, you know, back to back. We could, you know, jump from one, you know, panel to another and really just skip and cut a lot of stuff. And I think that fluidity, you don't, if you do that in a film, did you ever watch David Lynch's Dune movie?
Yeah.
Dude, it's one of those movies where you like watch it. Yeah, it's hard because it's like a 4-hour film that was cut into 3 hours that the studio made him cut into 2 hours. And it's one of those things where if you blink or just get up or turn your head for a second and you turn back and you're like, how did we wind up here? What is going on? But with comics, you can kind of do that and it'll make sense, because you're like, oh, okay, this is like a new page. Like this is a new scene. We could just cut to a bunch of stuff or flip from different timelines or time periods like way faster than you can like in a film where it makes sense. Like even the reader has a moment to pause and be like, oh, this just happened. Okay, let me go up to here. All right, cool. And like make sense of it. like, not that you want to have them doing homework and go back and forth, but those type of cold cuts and transitions, way easier to pull off in a comic than a film, and therefore you're able to cut a bit faster, I feel.
And a little bit more satisfying for the reader too, because like in a film, you want to see something. If you're gonna like, oh, like, you know, like a beat could happen where you're like, you see the character with something, and then you cut to the next page, and then you see like the aftermath of what happened with that item. Like that's a little bit more appealing to a reader, or at least to myself, because like you're doing a little bit of work as a reader. You're like, oh crap, like, well, that went bad. In my head, I imagine it went bad like this. But like if you did it in a film, it's kind of cheap, because you're like, well, you're not going to show me that. I mean, it could work as a comedic beat, but like, it could be like a little bit of a cheap cut, I guess.
There was, I can't recall the movie on top of my head, but there's like a horror, I think it was a horror movie, but some film, I don't know. But every time there was a death, you wouldn't see it on screen. They would go behind a door or something, and you'd hear the scream, or like, you know, the blood splatter shootout or something, you know what I mean? Something along those lines. And it's like, dang, I do feel a little like cheated, or the camera pans and you just hear whatever. That only works a handful of times, you know? But like comics, it's way easier to pull off a scene like that.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, there's a little bit of expectation in a film, I think, where you're like, show me that moment, since this is moving pictures, like show me that moment, as opposed to, you know, now you got to deal with the aftermath of that moment that you wish that you saw. But like, I feel like that works a lot better in a couple of different ways, like whether it's an action sequence or a comedic beat. I think both of those kind of work in a comic. Maybe not so much in a film. Definitely works in a comedy beat in a film, because you can have the great, like, oh, he's walking in with a chocolate cake, and then the next time you see him, the chocolate cake's on the ground. Like, that's kind of funny. But you know, I don't know.
And it's cool stuff that you can play with, like paneling in that sense too. You can make it's easier and funner than if you did that in a film, where a film just shows them and then the cake's on the floor. You're like, oh, well, like, I wonder what happened. Like, but like in a comic, you could kind of interpret it more like a movement, like more of a shuffle, and then the end result. Like, you can't just do that direct cut in any other way. You got to show the full playthrough of everything, and like, I get it now. Like, it's wild. It's insane what you can do with, you know, the differences in these mediums, and how sometimes they might seem more restrictive than others. It's cool how you change my perspective on a lot of things with like film to screenwriting. I love to like talk craft with you too, more all the time. Like this was, I had so many things to ask you on this episode, like, you know, your struggles and all that, the typical stuff we run through. But the craft aspect, I feel like, is just like one of those things we don't touch up on enough. So thank you so much, Eric. Like, this has been super insightful. I think all of our viewers and writers are going to appreciate it too. I think all of us writers need a little boost of like, am I doing some stuff right? Like, is this, you know, pro or bad, or what are some good advices? Why don't you tell us? Oh yeah, exactly.
So it's better to do that. You know, we're all just gotta be kind to yourselves too, as writers. Yeah, because I'm not.
And just trial and error. You know what I mean? Like, you keep on doing scripts, and then you look back at your old work. And I was digging through some files on my computer recently just to clean it out, and I was finding old scripts and finding old stories, and I was like, I am light years ahead of this now that I've done this 20 or 30 times. And it's just like, just keep practicing and keep learning and keep observing and pulling from your other mediums and testing out what works and doesn't work. Because until you type it out and then look at it, you're really not going to know.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let us know where we could find you and what you're up to in 2024.
Well, you can check out Outer Space Comic. That's going to be at Outer Space Comic on Instagram. We do most of the communication for that project through Instagram. Ben and I have a couple of different, Ben Collins. He's at Benjamin L. Collins on Instagram. Eric and Allred on Instagram, but we work together. We're collaborators, writers, and we have a couple of other irons in the fire right now, working on a couple different stories. But yeah, Outer Space is going to be we're going to be hitting strong with issue 2 and 3 here in 2024, and hopefully a couple more arcs out of that as well. But then we also have
we have a secret project going on ourselves, and then you were also in the CyberSync anthology, which should be releasing.
I didn't know if that was going to be okay. Yeah, I didn't know if that was going to be out before, so I was like, maybe CyberSync as well. That's a great book. So I'm super just stoked to read everybody else's stories in there. Like,
I can't wait for you all to see it.
Those little glimpses, the little teases have been too much for me. Titillating, as they say.
Well, I super appreciate it, and I can't wait to get you back on the show. I know we'll have you on many other times. There's so much to talk to you about, and it's fun talking to another writer about craft. It's always like super entertaining. So, Eric, until next time, thanks for hanging.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.